we're going to ask the panelists a series of questions, and then, as I said, we'll have an opportunity for you all to engage again. What I want to do is start off, though, by having each of our panelists introduce their foundation. I want them to talk about their philanthropic priorities, both overall and as they relate to K-12 education. And also kind of reference, if you can, what is your spending level for K-12? Has that changed recently? And also, how does your grant-making process work? Is it by application only? Do you have an open grant process? And we'll kick this off with Christina.
Sure, thank you, Stephen, and thanks for having me here and for the very interesting information that you just presented. So I am the Senior Program Officer at the W. Clement and Jessie V. Stone Foundation. It's a family foundation currently based here in San Francisco. We're actually moving this summer back home to where the foundation started in Chicago. Mr. Stone made his money in insurance many years ago, and he was a firm believer in really giving back to the community and giving while he was still here and alive. And so he just passed away actually about 10 years ago, and he has brought not only the next generation of Stones, but the next and the next generation of Stones into the foundation. And so we have a board of 14 family members that live in the Bay Area, in Chicago, in Boston, New York, and now Philadelphia. And so we fund in those geographic areas. We just recently added Philadelphia, a few grantees there. And our issue areas, our portfolios cover youth development, early childhood education, and K-12 education. And within K-12 education, our focus is really on, for lack of a better term, human capital and helping improve the human capital in urban school districts and systems. And so we focus on teachers, principals, and really the district level management. So we support a lot of teacher and principal recruitment, preparation, induction programs. And just to get back to your question around how much we spend in K-12 education, overall, I think this coming year we'll have about $120 million, of which we give about $5 million away each year. And that's split across our 3 portfolio areas. So it's not a lot, and those are, again, that's split across the geographic areas that I mentioned. But what we try to do, and what I really like about Stone, a couple of things. One is that we don't just do project support grants. We do a lot of general operating support grants. And I'm sure you can agree that that's really appreciated to have that flexibility with the money. And then secondly, for our education grantees, we convene them every year. And I've been at foundations where we convene them and it's really all about the foundation's agenda and priorities. And Stone is much more, we want to hear what the grantees and what the field needs, and then try to bring resources, not just dollars, but other resources like experts around communications or around growth and scale, or whatever the grantees are struggling with. We interview them before the convening and we ask them, what do you want to hear about and what do you need more of? And then we try to design an agenda around that. So it's just a little bit about Stone, and I'll sort of touch upon a bit more as we go through the rest of the questions.
That was great. Renell.
Good morning, everybody. I work for the Rogers Family Foundation. This is the start of month 3 for me at Rogers. I'd spent 8.5 years previously at the Stewart Foundation. I'm really excited to speak on the Rogers strategy to you all today. Rogers was founded by T. Gary Rogers, the founder and owner of Dreyer's ice cream brand, and with it located in Oakland. The family wanted to focus its work specifically in Oakland, and we do Oakland in its entirety 24/7. All of our funding focused on K-12 public education. The foundation, prior to my arrival, had just completed its 3-year strategic plan, and it does its strategy on a 3-year cycle. So beginning in 2013 through 2015, we're focused on 3 big goals. First on literacy, 3rd grade reading. By 2020, 85% of Oakland students reading at grade level or better. The next goal is on quality autonomous schools. And again, the focus I think there is on quality, both in the traditional public school as well as in public charter schools. And then lastly is addressing and recognizing the achievement gap for Oakland students and working towards creating more quality seats and availability for that in Oakland as well. To get there, the strategy focuses on three major initiatives and 2 grant-making areas. The 3 major initiatives, as one you might be able to tell, is through an Oakland Literacy Coalition, again, focused on the 3rd grade reading and building a collective impact strategy around that with a range of partners that are many in Oakland. The second initiative, which I'm really excited about, it was something I was studying and looking at, and very much interested in how Rogers is pursuing it. It's blended learning. Everyone know it? Blended? Yeah? Blended learning. Yeah. And just very quickly for everyone not familiar, it's the use of technology and determining how the use of technology in the classroom can really advance student learning, but really still focused on the role of the teacher and how they can differentiate and understand how to serve all the kids at different need levels in their classroom. And we're in our 2nd cohort already, so we're up to 8 schools starting this year on that and wanting to continue to grow that. And it's something we're also doing fund development for on behalf of Oakland schools. The 3rd initiative is focused on quality schools. And again, that in large part is trying to work with the district and really thinking about what a portfolio system might look like for what quality might be in Oakland. So that whether it's the district school or a charter school, the ability for schools to demonstrate and be judged on what quality and what outcomes they're achieving for students is something we're really concentrating on. We have 2 areas that we're calling grant-making areas, but that I feel fold very much into supporting the other 3 areas, one of which is leadership in education and talent management. And that's about some of the organizational capacity of some of, as Stephen was alluding to, the larger organizations that might be working in that arena to build a better pipeline of leaders, quality teachers in Oakland. And the last is making sure that we wrap around and understand sort of the policy advocacy arena is an area we're working on called Community Reform Voice, an organization in Oakland called Great Oakland Public Schools. Has been very instrumental in moving issues around teacher quality, quality schools, and we're working very closely with them around the issues around policy and advocacy in Oakland specifically. And then also trying to figure out how that might leverage all the way up to the state level and where we might be able to play a role down the line in key state pieces that, on policy that might affect our local jurisdictions. Very quickly, like Christina and like many other funders, it was funny the other day I was at a convening in Lake Tahoe where funders like Gates and Walton, who are the top 2 I think on your list, we all say we only have a little money. And when they say they only have a little money, it's really funny to hear them say that. But it's true. It's absolutely true, depending on where you actually work. But the same, we have very limited dollars focused in on Oakland. Our giving is around 2.3 for our strategy, which I feel is a pretty good amount for focusing on one particular geography, but it's still quite limited. We've also, as by virtue of having a strategy in place, have had to exit certain fields like youth development and tightened up some of our work so that we can make bigger and a little bit more impactful grants and changing what had been maybe $5,000, $10,000, $15,000 grants and raising that. And in the raising of that, we've had to exit some of the work. We don't have a letter of inquiry process. The best way, I think, for most folks who are interested in us And I think this is probably true for most foundations, is to really understand the strategy of the foundation and then just reach out. And the best person to reach out to probably in our organization is me. And I'm very open to having conversations with people. I think that's part of the ethos of Rogers. While we don't have an LOI process, the ability to access us and talk to us, as long as you feel like you can make an alignment with our strategy. And our strategy's right there on our homepage. Got to look for it. It's a little bit buried right now, but it's on the homepage towards the bottom, and you just click on the strategy and review it. And I think it's pretty transparent about what we're trying to do. So I'll stop there.
Great. Lisa.
Thank you. The San Francisco Foundation is a community foundation with approximately 500 donors. The net worth for the San Francisco Foundation is over $1 billion, and the awards annually are close to $90 million. Of that $90 million, about $20 million come through the program department, and I'll explain the different programmatic areas in a moment. And the other $70 million typically come from donor funds, donor advised funds, special donor directed funds, where the donor actually has already highlighted key organizations or strategies that they want to invest in. We have some direct interface with donors, and that happens on an as-needed basis, where the donor requests a program officer actually sit with them and do a little bit of think tank to talk about trends in education or trends in the various areas which we fund. The education program at the San Francisco Foundation, where that I run, our grant making was just a little bit under $2 million this year. I also run a nonprofits transition fund, and I'll tell you about that in just a moment. So in the competitive grant making area, which I represent the education department, we have departments in arts and culture, community health, community development, the environment, and education, and those are our core areas. We have also developed some strategic priority areas, particularly in response to the downturn in the economy, in the area of safety net, jobs and job training, and affordable housing, or if you will, foreclosure prevention. In addition to that, we run grant making in our faiths program, in an immigrant integration program, and we also have a community leadership program. So I'm going to be talking specifically about the education program today, and we have 3 specific strategic areas. I'll preface them with a bit of a preamble, and the preamble is, we've done a lot of research on the necessary conditions for learning, and we've really landed on this sort of mantra that we believe that every child has the right to arrive to school every day free from hunger, from pain, and from fear, having slept in a warm and nurturing environment, arriving ready to learn at every grade level, and being received by a school that's ready for students in every way that they arrive. And we believe that children have the right to all of the learning and supports necessary to learn at grade level, every grade level, and graduate on time from 5th or 6th grade into middle or junior high school, from middle or junior high school into high school, and from high school into college, career, and to be ready for community. And because we feel so strongly about that, we have landed on, for the last several years now, 3 strategic areas. And they're on the website, www.sff.org. They are early childhood education, equity, and full-service community schools. The equity area makes people a little squirmy because we have borrowed language from leaders in the Bay Area that talk about reducing and eliminating the predictive power of race and class and demographics on student achievement. We've embraced full-service community schools because we're really looking at all the necessary conditions for learning, schools being open early and late, offering before and after school programs, tutoring, counseling, health services, parent education, mentoring, arts and culture, all of that. The old African proverb concept of it still takes a village to raise a child. And in early childhood, because we really believe that no matter whether it's a cottage industry or a very, very large early childhood serving center, that we have an obligation to represent the diversity, the multicultural approach from each child, and to provide the highest quality instruction, care, and nurturing possible. So that's why we've landed on those 3. How does it work? We have typically one open, responsive, competitive grant cycle a year. It used to be two, but about 3 years ago, we switched it to just one. We have our electronic grantee portal open for about I'm looking at my fellow Josh over here, about 2 months, November, December, January, about 2 months. We have a long vetting process of due diligence. The application is simply a form. It's about a 5-page form, but it's very, very detailed. If you answer the questions for the San Francisco Foundation, you probably have lots of information to apply to almost anybody else. And our awards in the education grant-making program are actually pretty small. Last year, we awarded somewhere between 95 and 100 grants, small grants of $15,000 to $20,000. And so I have to tell you, and it's a secret, so don't tell anybody what I'm about to say, but we are seriously considering whether this, as a community foundation that serves 5 counties, whether this continues to be the most prudent approach for us, or whether we need to look at perhaps awarding half that number for double the amount, or maybe even a third that number of grants for an even larger amount. And we're weighing the trade-offs of what does that mean to the community at large with over 1,000 applications that come in and hundreds of grants that get awarded from education over the course of a year. What does that mean when a community foundation pulls back? So we're going to be engaging some of you in phone calls, focus groups, and conversations probably over the summer. And that's why when you go on the website, if you go on the website tonight, you will not see the timeline posted for when the next open competitive grant cycle for education is open yet, because we haven't put it up yet. And I'll stop there.
Very interesting. Yeah, and just that strategy around grant size, number versus what's the impact?
It's a huge issue with so many trade-offs.
Yeah, yeah, and there's no perfect answer. That's trying to find the one that will be right. Ronell, we're going to kick off with you. And our first question, we're going to start looking nationally, although you can definitely frame your response in terms of what's happening in California. So the Obama administration has invested notable amounts of energy and resources on improving public education in the United States. We've also seen the adoption of the Common Core standards in 45 states, including California. From your perspective, have we begun to realize some benefits from these initiatives, or will it take longer for the impact to be felt more broadly, and why do you think that? Yeah, it's like the globe.
We're on camera, right? It's always fun.
What
It's always
happens
fun
at
when
the
that-
Foundation Center
you
stays
know,
at the
you
Foundation
always
Center.
deny what you said it on a panel sometime. I think like our work in philanthropy, I think it is a little too early to tell. I think some of the work around the Common Core standards and the adoption by 45 states is very telling around trying to get closer to what it means to be competing on the international market and where our students are actually measured, not just by what we're doing from state to state, but really thinking about that more broadly. But again, I think it's too early to tell. I think it's been very interesting how the administration has approached education. I think I give them a lot of credit for creating a competition and really pushing states to be their best. The issue I probably have with that is, as a public entity, it's a question, again, of equity of where everyone is receiving resources. When it's a competitive marketplace, it's going to, in some ways, create winners and losers. And sometimes you're a winner or loser by a couple of points on a rubric, depending on who's judging on those things. So I think we've all felt that as Californians, and probably not participating significantly in that. And I don't believe received any resources until we got to the place when it got down to the district level. And so I think that it's a little too early to tell, but I will say that some of the benefits around what the administration and what they've been doing, I think it has energized the philanthropic market to be a partner. As you were describing earlier, Stephen, the fact that funders joined and pooled resources around that portal and around I3 really galvanized folks around some of the opportunities that were created by the administration.
Okay. Lisa.
Well, I have to preface my remarks by saying that I've been in public education for over 25 years. I actually received my teaching credential in 1978, so you can do the math on that. And I've seen every major education reform strategy as it's been played out in California and in the United States. And I have to say that although Common Core I think is extremely important, and in fact I think we're already starting to see some results nationally in terms of reaching the highest aggregate graduation rate since the 70s across the nation. And I don't know if you can actually attribute that to Common Core or the focus on rigor across the board, but Common Core is no panacea. But what really excites me about President Obama's initiatives are his legacy initiatives, and I'm talking about the Promised Neighborhoods Initiative through the U.S. Department of Education, the Full Service Community Schools Act, and also Choice Neighborhoods, which is coming out of HUD. And those all continue to focus on establishing and maintaining the necessary conditions for learning. And as a community foundation, we continue to focus on those. And so those give me a lot of excitement because they're beginning to yield some very significant results across the board, across the nation. And this data comes from the Coalition for Community Schools, Children's Aid Society, and others. But you can count on these kinds of approaches really making a significant improvement in attendance rates, a significant improvement in persistence rates, student graduation rates, teacher attendance rates, and also, to the extent that it's measured, school climate, school culture, and sort of the motivation and the willingness to hang in there and learn. And so that can be broken down and unpacked more in detail at another time, but we're very, very encouraged about the impact of the programs that really focus on establishing a foundation for the necessary conditions for learning.
Christina?
Sure. So I think what we need to remember, there's been a lot of emphasis on the Common Core, and the new standards really are part of a larger set of interrelated reforms. And so, you know, including not just the standards, but new assessments, aligned curriculum, and also efforts to build the capacity of educators. And so I think that you know, Renell's right, it's too early to tell, but I think the next 2 years are going to be really critical, especially as the new assessments are rolled out. I also, you know, totally agree that I think the department has really structured a lot of their initiatives in a really interesting and innovative way that is drawing in foundations that couldn't have participated and helped support some of these initiatives before. And so even Stone, you know, a smaller family foundation, has helped by contributing some matching funds for I3 grants, for example. And it just, for us, it's really a great way to leverage some of our dollars in a much bigger way and to feel part of this, you know, national reform effort. So I think I'm looking forward to seeing the results of those.
That's great. And actually, your comments are a good preface for our next question, which we'll begin with Lisa. U.S. Department of Education placed a strong emphasis on engaging foundations in its recent education reform initiatives. And in essence, I think you could say a pretty much unprecedented effort. And a number of foundations have provided support coordinated, such as what Christina mentioned with I3. We had states funding consultants to prepare their Race to the Top applications. And my question then is, do you think there's now a greater willingness among foundations to seek out ways to collaborate with state governments, local school districts, or even individual schools, and vice versa? And independent of that, what do you see as the ongoing challenges in facilitating those types of relationships?
So I'll start with the ongoing challenges. I believe that if you pulled up the slide, and I bet you have it in your head, if you pulled up the slide or the pie chart that demonstrates the amount of foundation and philanthropic dollars in education compared to public dollars, that the slice of the pie would be so thin that it's far smaller than the one that you take at midnight when you've already had too much pie and you don't want anybody to see that you even had a bite. I mean, that's how tiny the philanthropic dollars truly are, and yet we're seeing a growing presence of philanthropy in conversations with policymakers and seeing themselves as policy influencers. And I believe particularly in the downturn in the economy, when foundations wanted to look at making a greater and deeper impact with their dollars, many of them went straight to policy philanthropy. And so you're seeing them engage in many of these conversations. I believe that the Department of Education knows that not only have public dollars diminished significantly, but may continue to diminish as we continue to spend more and more of our nation's dollars on things besides education, and we continue to cut domestic programs. And so I think that there's sort of building, doing sort of a layup for more reliance on, since we're in the throes of basketball playoffs over and over, a reliance on philanthropic dollars. But I also feel like philanthropy needs to be careful that we don't overplay our hand in terms of how important we are with the policy influence. Having said that, you can take a look at, for example, and I'm not going to pick on Gates because I have a great deal of respect for them, but you can take a look at the work that a philanthropic foundation can do and the influence that they can make on education, and you have to scratch your head sometimes. So I'm talking about the small schools movement, for example, with Gates, which was amazing. And in fact, Christina did some work on it. She used to work with Gates a few years ago. And all of a sudden, people were considering the research base for small schools. What does it mean? There was a lot of implementation of small schools. When I started the San Francisco Foundation almost 8 years ago, I inherited a small schools grant-making strategy. And now if you take a look at the research, and you take a look at the way that people are talking about the impact or the non-impact of that, and you take a look at the dollars that were invested, you have to ask yourself, what should have been done before there was this major multi-million-dollar investment in small schools to unpack what does it really mean besides just the size of a school to do small schools. So I think that and this is going to get into the next question, so I'll stop. But I think that examining data, examining research, examining the literature out there on what works is far more important than the think tank notions of philanthropic leaders making assumptions about what worked for them and how they can tweak it and make it work for American public education.
Music to my ears. Christina.
Sure. So I think I'll start with the challenges as well. In collaborating with districts and states, we've found in working in places like Chicago or Philadelphia, and even here in the Bay Area, that leadership, school leader and district leader turnover has been a just significant challenge. In Chicago, I believe we've had 5 superintendents, and they don't use the word superintendents. I think they use, I don't know if it's CEO or something like that. But in the last 4 or 5 years, and so when you think about the amount of staff changes and strategy changes, and then the partners that they're working with, how much turnover is happening with that, it's just it's daunting. And so I think one thing, and I've only been at Stone for about a year now, and so I'd like to think that it was foresight that or reflection upon that kind of challenge that led them to this. But they really have sort of invested in partners that are both kind of inside and outside the system. So in Chicago, for example, the Chicago Fund for Public Education works very closely with the district, but we also fund a lot of youth organizing groups, Voice, for example, out there. And so to kind of straddle both in working closely with government and to keep those external forces kind of pushing them forward, and those kind of checks and balances, I think, is probably a wise approach from the philanthropic standpoint.
So in a sense, you're saying, it helps having an outside entity that can provide that continuity. Is that what you're suggesting?
Well, and this is probably getting to one of your later questions, but we all know with some of the economic challenges, we've had a lot of turnover on the nonprofit side too. Right. And it's hard work, and it's, especially among development directors, and we're seeing a lot of turnover. But so I don't know if continuity would be the right word, but certainly kind of holding their feet to the fire and making sure that the goals that they set out to achieve, nothing's kind of slipping through the cracks.
That's great. That's a great point. Ronell?
I think I'll just co-sign on what these two said about the challenges and try to concentrate on what I think are, answer the question on the willingness of foundations. I'm just going to say yes. I think that there is a willingness to try to do a little bit more on that and push. There's just fewer of those that are available that's doing that work, particularly at a statewide level in California. There's just fewer that are there and available to try to work with state and local government officials around that work. There's also just restrictions. As a private family foundation, you can't get into the business of policy making very directly. And so you work on things like nonpartisan independent research and educating policymakers around some issues. But there's just fewer foundations in California that are doing that. Hewlett's not doing it any longer. Gates isn't doing it very much any longer. And so what also I think needs to happen in terms of the linkages you were talking about, Christina, is just at the local level, whether it's Oakland, San Francisco, Chicago, the Inland Empire, there needs to be a better match about what's happening at the local advocacy policy level and how those folks can maybe link up to a state level. So as I mentioned during our introductions, I think trying to think about policy issues, whether it's weighted student formula and how that affects Oakland, is really critical for us to think about. Then how do we wind up connecting that to the larger issues that are happening at the state, to the benefit of serving our local communities in the ways we want to have happen.
That's great. And I'll use moderator's privilege to put in a brief plug for a couple of very slim, but I'd like to think valuable reports we produced as part of the Foundations for Education Excellence. And these looked at the Grantmaker perspective on the first round of the Race to the Top competition, and also then the ongoing education reform efforts and how Grantmakers were thinking about some of the challenges in working with government officials at various levels, because I think it speaks both to these questions, and there are great insights here that I wish I'd had for the report. But I think also in some respects, I think speaks to being nonprofit partners with Grantmakers, really applies across the board in terms of how funders are thinking about this work and their own accountability in trying to achieve success. All right, so for the next question, Christina, we're going to start with you. And this is focusing on charter schools. I mentioned we were going to talk about this a little bit more. It seems in recent years that charter schools have moved from being a school reform effort unwelcome by many to at least tolerated, if not embraced by most. So based on the data I've seen, the jury appears to be out on whether charter schools themselves are delivering better education results. But do you think they've provided a spur for improving traditional public education, or would you say that other factors have been more important?
I'd say that in some areas and districts, they have indeed spurred change and have had a positive impact. And for example, New York City comes to mind, where Bloomberg has, there's a lot of charter schools there, but at the same time, they have the innovation zone of schools. And there's an organization that I've funded over the years that works both in New York City and now here in San Francisco and Oakland, the Internationals Network for Public Schools, which is focused on, we have a fan, recently arrived immigrant students, so high schools that serve these immigrant students. And I was just talking with Claire Sylvan the other day about how, in some new districts where they're looking to expand, do they need to go charter in order to get some of the autonomies and flexibilities that they need to implement their model? And she said that districts are now more and more open to having them come in and provide those autonomies and that flexibility without them having to go around the district or find other ways like charter. And so I think that's one example, but I think that there are many out there where districts realize that they need to step it up.
Interesting. Renell?
Who cited the numbers on how many charters there was? Right, it was 3% nationally, maybe 6 to 7% in California. How many of you know what that percentage is like in Oakland? Yeah. Yes, it's actually a little bit more than that, right? So if there's 36,000 kids in Oakland Public Schools, Oakland Unified Schools, there's nearly 10,000 in charter schools in Oakland. I think from our perspective, and the way this works, is it still comes down to quality, opportunity, choice, and innovation for charters. And so we don't try to differentiate, I think, working closely with the district about what district schools look like and working with charters. I think we focus in on charters around the things that they have and how that can be accessible for those who are succeeding. So things around quality and autonomy are things that we're very, very interested in. I think that that's where some traction is actually happening. So we can get behind James Wilcox and Aspire, Jenna Stauffer and Lighthouse, and Hasten Thomas and Education for Change. They're great operators in Oakland, but we also need to recognize there probably aren't quality schools from some of the charters also. So as a district moves to quality school review, and as other places think about where that looks like, for us it's still about the quality, the autonomies, and how you can get that and deliver more quality seats across the districts for all of the students in Oakland, both in charter schools and in districts. So in the smaller sense of a place like Oakland, I think we're beginning to see some of that happen, where quality school review looks good, seems right, and has a very strong and rigorous process for granting charters. And we hope that that will be something that will continue as Oakland figures out where its leadership and direction goes in the future.
Great. Lisa, charters, what do you think?
Well, before I answer that question, I'm going to footnote my last question and share that despite what I said about philanthropy overplaying their hand in the policy arena with public education, we at the San Francisco Foundation have already partnered with over a dozen districts to provide small grants to help them plan their full-service community schools approach when the request has come directly from the district office level through intermediary partners. We have felt that it's important to do that. So we are operative at the local level, helping them create some of their policies. So regarding charters, you know, the San Francisco Foundation funds a few charter schools, and we select them very, very carefully. In terms of, you know, maybe a moral stance is too strong of a word, but I'm going to say it anyway. One of our ongoing issues with charter schools has been that if a charter goes into an area and there are children or youth in the area who do not have an agent to represent them to get them into a charter school, and then the parents, the active parents and the concerned and motivated parents step up for their children and pull them out of their local school or the school that they're assigned to, we get sort of the what's left question. And very often, not always, but very often in geographic areas, we see that students that are struggling but have significant aptitude are pulled out of the traditional public school by parents who want so much more for their children. And we find that there are a number of kids who continue to struggle, who have no agency in the personal term at home, perhaps not a parent, an auntie, a grandma that can drop all of the life's emergencies to actually get on a waiting list for 4 or 5 schools and do all the research on greatschools.net, which we awarded their very first grant to. It's an amazing website. If you don't know greatschools.net, look it up tonight. You can look up any school in America. But that doesn't mean that we're against charter schools. It means that we feel that charters need to consider the notion of having a very strong, positive, interdependent relationship with their districts so that they truly can be what the vision for charters started out to be in the 90s, and that is a lab, a place, and a space to pilot the kind of innovation that can then be replicated across a school district. So having said that, the recent research that I've done on what makes for an effective charter school and what can spur charters to influence other traditional public schools across the United States indicates that there's a handful of things that the most effective charter schools are exhibiting. And to my surprise, or maybe not to my surprise, they're all things that you can do without having a charter. It's all about teaching. It's all about the quality of teaching in the classroom and the impact that it has on the student. And specifically, and, do a Google search like I did, do it tonight. Specifically, what I found is a relentless vision for rigor, that teachers refuse to water down the curriculum because they've got high poverty kids from low performing areas in disadvantaged neighborhoods. So they're refusing to compromise on rigor. An intensive look at tutoring, teacher tutoring, extended time and extended day, which sometimes you need a charter to do. And this also relentless look at the balance between rigor and relationship, where the teacher believes that all really means all. All students, no matter how much metal they have in their face and in their body and how many piercings they walk into the classroom with, or whether they dropped an F-bomb in the hallway and then walked in and sat down in a huff, but that all really means all. And so we're looking carefully at whether or not you need a charter to accomplish some of these things. And if you do have a charter, what kind of a relationship it forges with the local district. So having said that, I will say that I do believe that if you look at the research on what's working for the most effective charter schools in the United States, and you glean these things, that it can in fact spur traditional public schools to ask themselves, well, why aren't we doing that? And why can't we do that? And what's standing in the way? And how can we begin to attack these barriers so that we too can have some of the same results that perhaps the star charter school across town has?
Great. Ronell, next question, we'll start with you. So we've definitely been touching on this in terms of the comments everyone's made so far, but from your vantage point, where do you see K-12 education reform efforts have gained the most traction in California? And this can be both geographically, based on issue focus, broadly. Where are you kind of excited about the work that's happening?
Can I say charters?
Sure. You may not make it out in one piece, but sure.
I think that it's a tough question. I think from a geographic standpoint, I'll just kind of draw back from where I've previously been employed. And when you kind of think about it at a statewide level, if you look at what districts people are always holding up as, wow, how did they get to that place? You know, places like Sanger in the Central Valley have shown remarkable gains. They're also, I believe, undergoing a superintendent transition now. And so you want to know and understand whether they're going to plateau there. How much was it, again, the cult of personality of a particular leader? How much of it is going to be about the governance that the board has to continue the gains that they've made and bridging the achievement gap amongst their Latino and African American students? So Sanger's always held up as a pretty good example, as is Long Beach. You know, Long Beach has also had that. And, Long Beach has a very unusual situation with Chris Steinhauser as their superintendent, having essentially grown up in the system, come through the leadership ranks, and is still there and probably planning for what succession looks like down the line. So I think places that have shown actual gains, as we currently measure them by our accountability standards, there are a couple places there. I think that the community schools work that Lisa's championed, particularly here in the Bay Area, and when we think about them looking at nationally, I think that the strength around that, around what she was describing as working specifically with some districts and beginning to push and recognizing that, I think it's our outgoing superintendent in Oakland who's probably said it a lot about that the system is necessary but maybe insufficient to meet the needs of all of our kids in Oakland, and that some of that and working with districts and planning that work, I give a lot of credit to her around the work here in the Bay Area around that, and it's probably some of the leading work in community schools around the country. So I'll stop there.
Lisa.
Well, what a segue, Ronell. I didn't even ask him to do that. You know, of course, of course, I'm gonna bring it right back to establishing the necessary conditions for learning, and I'm going to talk about funding in the 5 counties that we're working with. I might say a little bit about LA too, but although we're not doing some specific funding in LA. But we are excited about the trends in full-service community schools. We're excited that there are a number of leaders who are looking at the whole child again. And we're, I won't say we're excited about the shortcomings of No Child Left Behind legislation, but we are excited that the spotlight on an intensive look at reading and math scores has forced districts and forward-thinking leaders to look at why the rigor alone didn't pay off, and to look at the kind of supports and services and interventions that are necessary to, again, to create these conditions for learning. So districts specifically that we are working with in the Bay Area to help develop their full-service community schools agenda are parts of East Palo Alto and Redwood City, San Francisco, San Rafael, West Contra Costa, particularly in Richmond and in San Pablo, Emeryville, Oakland, Hayward, San Leandro, and Alameda. Each of these superintendents have been working closely with some key selected intermediaries to create a plan for full-service community schools. And they're in different places along the continuum. But it's some of the most exciting work that I'm seeing, because they're realizing that if you ask any teacher or any principal, if you have students that show up every day, healthy and ready to learn, and if you're seeing a decrease in the amount of disruptive behavior in the classroom, and if you're seeing better relationships between teachers and students in terms of communication, kindness, and respect, and more parents coming to campus, not because their kids have necessarily gotten in trouble, but because they want to be there. If you see those four things, Mr. Teacher, Ms. Principal, will it impact your school? And the teachers and the principals that say, no, those things are a distraction, well, you know what? They need to leave. They need to get a new career. Because anybody that's been in education for even a year or even 6 months can tell you that attendance, behavior, attitude and aptitude, and positive parental participation mean the world to whether or not your school is going to be successful.
Christina.
So community schools was on my list as well. So I won't say more about that. But I do want to point out that in both Renell and Lisa's answers, they mentioned the district leadership that these efforts take. And so again, I think that programs that that help support management and administration are just so key. One thing that we haven't talked about too much that I've really seen, I mean, everybody's heard that there's been traction on, is the weighted student funding formula at the state level. And, you know, I was working in California at Gates about starting in 2006, and we really tried to tackle school finance in collaboration actually with Stewart Irvine and Hewlett, and funded a lot of research, and just couldn't get anywhere with it at the time. And you know, the economy was in a much different place then. And so when I heard from Stone grantees that they are now working on this issue, even if they're you know, an Oakland-focused grantee, you know, a locally focused grantee, but that they really saw an opportunity now to help push that statewide agenda around a weighted student funding formula. I was at first nervous about it, but then when, you know, I dug in a little deeper and saw how much momentum there is now behind it and how much the governor is really pushing for that, I saw it as a real opportunity, and I just, you know, there's traction now, and you asked about traction.
That's great. Very interesting. All right, so final question for our panel. We'll lead off with Lisa. The Great Recession led some foundations to tighten their focus, placing a greater emphasis on being strategic, reducing the number of program areas they were funding, multi-year and capital investments. Did your foundation's K-12 funding priorities change as a result of the economic downturn? And do you think education funders in general have settled into the new normal, despite our continuing economic fluctuations?
So yes, our education priorities changed. They narrowed into the three that I shared: early childhood, equity, and full-service community schools. Before that, there were 5 areas and an extra $1 million. So we gave up $1 million to an area, and I'll tell you about that in just a second. But the 5 former funding areas were in early childhood, youth development, family support, academic support, and systemic school reform. And so I found a way to bundle those together to really reflect the community schools funding, and then added in the equity and the early childhood based on a lot of research and extensive lit reviews that we'd done about creating the necessary conditions for learning. What the core 5 program areas did with the $1 million that they each gave up was to create a $5 million pool of funding to focus on safety net, jobs and job training, and foreclosure prevention.
Interesting.
Yeah, and so as we're think tanking the long-term impact of that, we're also considering, because the down economy, this dragon has a razor tail that's just as long. I mean, as far as you can see, that tail is going to go for the constituents that we're all working with. So right now we're having those internal think tank conversations to decide whether or not we're going to stick with those carved out priority areas around safety net and job training and foreclosure prevention, or whether we're going to massage it into something new.
Very interesting. And community foundations were absolutely at the forefront of responding to community needs during the economic downturn. And in fact, larger private foundations were funneling dollars to community foundations to that purpose. But it's heartening that you're continuing to do that work and be so thoughtful, but it's also discouraging that it's still so necessary.
Yes.
Yeah. Christina.
Sure. So our priority areas or focus areas didn't change. I think what changed is obviously our budget shrunk a bit, and so we didn't have the opportunity to bring in any new grantees. And so Stone, I think I missed in the beginning talking about our grant making and application process, but we don't have an LOI process. We do invite individual organizations to apply based on our strategy, but we tend to stick with them from year to year, and they're just 1-year grants, but we've had organizations that we've funded for 10 to 12 years, some longer, which is really great for those organizations that are grantees, but there's very few opportunities in leaner times to be able to then bring in new grantees. And so I think that is one change. The other is that that I think is really the point at which the foundation said, we need to make general operating support available rather than the project support grants. So that was another shift. And then I think, again, going back to what I said at the beginning about convenings, we really looked for ways to leverage our resources beyond our dollars. And so, how can we convene grantees? How can we use our foundation and our network with other funders to make introductions to help with their fundraising efforts, and just do really everything that we can as program officers to help when our grantees were really going through some tough times. And in some cases, that also meant carving out some of the funds to be put towards strategic or business planning, or leadership development when there's a transition at an organization, things like that.
Ronell.
I wasn't there at Rogers during the time of the recession, but what I will comment on is I think Rogers, which I've admired for a long time as a funder, has been pretty consistent. It tries to not overly increase its grant-making dollars, but it keeps it at a steady level of around 2.3 on behalf of Oakland consistently through whatever economic times there are. And we spend down more than what the minimum requirements are, which is, I think, also to their credit. I think the piece, the questions you were asking, I'm seeing that our work kind of going forward is not so much a cutback, but actually a propelling of things like multi-year and general support, and a recognition that when you have a strategy and you find and you identify your partners, you trust your partners are aligned with you and have demonstrated the alignment around their outcomes as connected to your strategy. So I'll go back again to the recent convening that I was at, where I had a couple of national funders in front of me, and whether it's me or Lisa or Christina, and we talk a little bit about our strategy, I think all funders are moving, and what the new normal is everyone is trying to move to becoming more strategic, particularly in the space around education, public education as a field of work. So the national funders are just begging their various partners of, like, please, before you approach, really think about your alignment to strategy, and they have them. What's their theory of action, or what is it that they're trying to achieve, and where's that alignment with their work, and how do your particular outcomes tie to theirs? I found it refreshing to hear them all talk about it that way, because I think we all talk about it this way also, and that there hopefully is the same sort of openness that we want to provide of having conversations after you've done a little work and research on studying, so that you're not wasting a lot of time trying to figure out, yeah, you know what, Rogers is just doing this, and they're approaching college access and success through this. I'm going to approach them in this manner, when actually college access and success might have been the youth development work that we'd previously done. That's no longer part of our institution's current movement forward. So for me, the new normal isn't maybe about where we're sitting in terms of assets and resources, particularly at Rogers, or really thinking about having transitioned from maybe more of a charitable banker approach to one that's trying to be really strategic about trying to drive the change that we want to see in the world.
That's great. Yeah, and I would just add, I think what's been very interesting to me as a longtime watcher of the foundation field is the degree to which the rubber really hit the road in terms of foundations collaborating with other partners, be they other funders, governmental entities, or NGOs. And in a sense, really, I think within education, providing a model for many other parts of the funding community. So at this point, we want to open up to your questions. As Janet had noted, we'll ask you to come up to the mic so we can record these, and don't be shy. Yes, good, we have someone starting us off. And what I'll also note, of course, as we always do for these types of, these parts of our program, please keep your questions general. It's not fundraising for specific programs. You can, buttonhole the panelists afterward. But so, that's the one qualifier. But otherwise, look forward to hearing your questions. Sir.
Thank you. My name is Tim Tabernick with the Center for Strategic Community Innovation. And I would just say that community schools for us is a given as the starting point of our work. But one of the things that I'm really curious about, excuse me, is that when we talk about Common Core, it seems to me like there's a lot of work that is to be done. We're developing sort of an outline of what that might look like, but there's really no curriculum. It requires, probably in a lot of ways, blended hybrid learning in order for differentiation for heterogeneous classrooms. And it also requires technology that a lot of for the assessment process that a lot of the school districts simply don't have. And so when we think about this sort of bold experiment that the federal government is undertaking, and sort of the sign-on of all these districts and states, I fear for the fallout when you have certain districts that are going to have the resources and are going to be able to do this work, and then others that are not going to have those resources. And so thinking about philanthropy and how it can really leverage this opportunity is something that I'd like to ask about for the panelists' opinion.
We'll just open that up. Whoever wants to comment.
I'll start. I think that's a really a concern that everybody has right now around the fallout. And I don't have the answer for you, but I will say that I know Lisa and I are both very involved with Grantmakers for Education, and I'm on a working group there that is doing a a lot of work to help fund education funders figure out what their role is in the rollout of Common Core and the implementation of Common Core. So just, I think on June 20th, we're going to have a webinar about, how can particularly local funders help those on the ground get ready for Common Core. So it's something that we're thinking a lot about and trying to work collectively to address.
Other thoughts? Or?
Just one real quick, I think it's a really good question, Tim. I also don't have the answer from a philanthropic lens, but I think one of the pieces that have to be decided is where the responsibility lies at the start, at the state level, and how does it trickle down in terms of the effect at the local level, and maybe that's where philanthropic responses are. Pushing on policies like in Oakland around what are you going to do with your facilities bond? What does modernization really mean? Is it really setting up the network and making sure you're prepared around that? And I think a lot of school districts are in that particular position. But I think the relationship at the state and local level needs to be looked at closely, and I'm not sure how funders will play that particular role, but there might be something in there.
So if we take a look at the best and worst case scenario for Common Core, there's a case to be made that at best, Common Core is going to standardize a knowledge base for the children and youth of our country so that they can compete in a global society. And at worst, it's going to standardize knowledge for fear of global knowledge. And you can try and figure out what I'm trying to say by that later on. Oh, no, that's not nearly as fun. But I think that, so I'm excited. I think Common Core is important, but I think that every district has to take stock of the money that's going into implementation and whether or not any of those dollars are really getting at, as my colleagues have said, are really getting at quality instruction. And if they're seen as two separate things, they need to be very, very careful how much money they spend. Ideally, you would combine high-quality instruction with the rollout of Common Core. And if you separate it, then I think we're going down a slippery slope of spending a lot of money on education reform again. But I can't stop this train.
Next question, please.
Hi, I'm Catherine with Junior Achievement of Northern California, and I wanted to ask about your familiarity with linked learning, which is a new educational framework that's had a lot of success in Oakland that kind of blends work-based learning with the traditional school curriculum, and how you think this will influence your own grant-making strategies as well as the success of the public school system in general. And it's for the whole panel. Thank you.
I'll jump in. I love linked learning. I love the concept, and I think that the more hands-on and project-based learning we do that creates relevance in the mind of a child or a youth, the more they will continue to engage in the instruction they're getting in school.
Again, everything Lisa said I agree with. What I have a problem with is how we in philanthropy put a label on all the stuff that we want out there, right? So we got blended learning, we've got linked learning, we've got deeper learning. There's going to be something that comes out very soon that I'm not ready to prepare to say that I know that some national funders are working on, but a lot of it is about what personalization really looks like, and I think that's what we're getting at. So I think we can get behind that, right?
Yeah.
So let's get behind what the personalization and keeping the student at the center of the work, but I'm okay if we just all drop what we're talking about in terms of what it's actually titled.
True of so many things in philanthropy.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know that the Irvine Foundation has been a huge proponent of linked learning, and we actually both support great organizations like Year Up that do a lot of work to help place students in internships, and that's actually part of our youth development portfolio, but something that we've been really supportive of. And it is interesting to see kind of how even just linked learning, that term has sort of evolved. I know I was here back in the day when there was the very kind of a battle between career and technical education and vocational education, and you know, it's come a long way, but yeah, we have to be careful about the terms that we use.
Good morning. My name is Cole, and I'm with the Brown Boy Project, and we run a program that links work on masculinity to work on race, and also work on math and critical reading. We're working with teachers and administrators. We're working with all of the 7th grade boys at Frick Middle School in East Oakland and their families. And my question goes to our theory of change, which is if we know that racial disparities and gender disparities and class disparities are such an important factor in why we see academic underachievement, why don't we see more of an emphasis on strategies and solutions that really embed racial justice and gender justice in their work? And then my second, easier, less political question is, what would you say is the single best evaluation tool that you've seen in the education field? Thank you.
Well, Cole, you're singing our song, you know. That's why we created this equity strand. And it hasn't been, it's been bumpy to figure out what we mean by it. It's been bumpy to create a theory of change and a strategy, a theory of action. I'd like to call out my colleague Josh Delphine over here with the dark hair and beard, who's been helping me. I'm pointing you out so that they can hit you up afterwards as well as me, so I can spit. But yeah, you're asking all the right questions. You're asking all the right questions, and so we're making a humble start at trying to direct a significant portion of our education funding in this area.
I think that I have actually been a part of a couple of initiatives and funding collaboratives that do focus on race and gender specifically, not here, but in New York City. There's the Black Male Donor Collaborative. And I think while it has been really helpful to bring attention to issues and programs focused on race and gender, frankly, it's been hard to sustain it. And I don't know if that's specifically a New York thing because Bloomberg came in and Open Society came in with a lot of money focused on that. But when you have smaller foundations that are trying to focus explicitly on that, it's just been hard to keep the momentum going. So, and then another challenge I think is that I've heard to some extent some, you know, and Lisa's a good example of explicit focus on race and equity issues, but I haven't seen that kind of collective work around it amongst funders out here. And yes, go to him for evaluation tools.
And I will just cite as a resource, we recently launched at the Foundation Center bmafunders.org, which is coming out of the Campaign for Black Male Achievement, as Christina mentioned, funded by Bloomberg Philanthropies and by OSF. And it is, in a sense, trying to create a resource intended to bring the grant-making community together around improving outcomes for Black men and boys, but certainly is an incredibly valuable resource for organizations working in that space.
Good morning, and I just want to also highlight the second part of your question around the evaluation tool. So perhaps if anyone would like to share thoughts on that before I ask my question.
Would you repeat your question about evaluation?
I think the question's around some of the best evaluation tools that you've seen within the field of education, if I'm paraphrasing correctly.
Yeah, I was actually thinking about that as you guys were describing. I think it depends on also what you're trying to think about from an evaluation. I know a lot of nonprofits that have had success with efforts to outcomes by social solutions. Might start there. There are other folks who are probably in the evaluation field that are really good. You might want to just turn around and talk to Tim right behind you. They might know some really good things, and you can look up Chris Putnam. She's done a lot of really, really good work. And really linking it, I think, to evaluation as part of storytelling. I really kind of appreciated that from our side.
I know that the Promised Neighborhoods Initiative nationally has signed on with ETO, with efforts to outcomes. But also, if you're interested in evaluation, particularly theory of change and indicators for a full-service community schools approach, if you look at the website communityschools.org and search on the evaluation toolkit, if you go into the, just a few pages into the evaluation toolkit on communityschools.org, you'll see not only a theory of change, but 2 pages of indicators that were created by a think tank of about 20 professional evaluation researchers across the United States that crunched the idea of the convergence of academics, health, social welfare, parent engagement, student behavior together. And so that might be a nice start.
Thank you. And my question, I guess I'll begin by saying, depending on which historian you speak with, they'll say that San Francisco's adventures in public education began about 185, 86 years ago. So we're still learning and growing, yet San Francisco is known across the state as being the highest academic achiever, but also holding the title of having the largest achievement gap, so being mindful of that. My question is, do you all think that San Francisco is in the midst of an education renaissance? And I say that because at the state level, you see local control funding formula talk happening. We've got a mayor who is committing to support in a very real way our middle schools. We've got board of supervisors who have been former Board of Education members. It seems like momentum is there, but from where you all sit, and perhaps even your colleagues on the corporate foundation side, do you see this as something different? Is this the renaissance?
And who are you?
I'm Masharika Madison with Parents for Public Schools of San Francisco.
So I'll start by saying that when I was at the Gates Foundation doing some work in California, we were not interested in San Francisco about, in 2006, 7, 8. And instead really focused on Oakland and LA and Long Beach and some other areas. Just having returned from being out of state for a number of years, I was really pleasantly surprised at the leadership in San Francisco, the progress. I actually just went to a partners and innovation meeting where they were engaging all of the, essentially like the superintendent's zone, the kind of the turnaround schools, and just phenomenal results in just, I think, 2 years. And so I do see the momentum, and I see, great opportunity moving forward. But I think you're right. I think they're onto something now.
Other thoughts? Or?
My short answer is yes.
And you've been around the longest, so I was hoping you would have some words of wisdom.
Well, my short answer is yes, because if you look at all the strategic interventions, they are phenomenal. From Hope SF to the superintendent zone to the focus on full-service community schools and being a test city for Common Core in math. I mean, that's a big, big continuum. Also, some of the best and most organized parents that you'll find. And yet, the disease that San Francisco suffers from is the disease of the most fabulous silos that end up getting kind of turfy and competing for the same dollars. And so I'm not saying that there's an unwillingness to collaborate, but I think that's the classic progressive disease, that you're trying to build a platform on which many hundreds can stand, but you won't throw your plank down if you don't agree on everything. If you don't agree on saving the trees, or if you don't agree on plastic bags, or if you don't agree on something else, then you're not going to throw your plank in it. So we've got to be better about building the big, big raft.
Thank you so much for that.
All right, and I'll note we have about 10 minutes and 4 more questioners. So questioners, if you can keep it brief, come on up.
Hi, my name is Lisa Pine. I'm with Laney College, where I teach welding, and I'm also developing programs for students in K-12 to come to the college and do welding and machining and construction, because I see all of this blended learning and project-based learning and deep learning and linked learning. All of these things really, really thrive in the CTE model. So my question is, do your foundations typically fund or look for career technical education, in particular ones that are traditionally associated with blue-collar jobs? And if so, which funding or strategic silo would I be addressing if I were asking for money?
Well,
Wow.
hypothetically for the broad interest, but yes. I mean, any thoughts on that?
I'll jump in. I think all of it, and this is the response I'm going to be coming going to become a broken record at Rogers around on is whether it's career tech, whether it's any piece around what kind of learning there is, it's still going to be about the quality of what the instruction looks like and what it's doing for the students and what chances it has of advancing the whole student development, but also their academic career. So I'm going to keep it broad right there. But we don't specifically fund in community career tech, but it's something that we would say, you know, if you're developing quality and it can get the kind of engagement, the kind of personalized learning, and gives students the skills that they need to succeed in career and life, then it would be something we would probably be open to. But it would really depend. I mean, so it's not a focal area, but again, it would have to come down to the quality of the schooling.
Thank you.
Ma'am? Oh,
I was just going to say, can I say I dig it that you're a welder? And we occasionally fund CTE, particularly if it's aligned with our strategy of early childhood, which it can be, or equity, or full-service community schools. But we look for that articulation between a K-12 institution and the higher ed institution so that there's a smooth handoff, because we don't want to lose the kids as they leave between high school and Laney.
You're speaking my language. Thank you. Hi, my name is Rachel Reinhardt. I direct the UC Berkeley History Social Science Project, and we convene teachers around discipline-specific planning in the inquiry process to inform and improve instructional practice. And mine is a more general question around, as sort of a new entity in the grant-seeking field, how does one raise their visibility or, as you all said, approach foundations that aren't looking or receiving LOIs?
Well, I think for starters, coming to events like this is a good way to just kind of build a network. And you know, it is challenging when we don't have an open LOI process, and it is really about that individual outreach and, you know, just emailing, picking up the phone, trying to set up meetings. I'd say, you know, for Stone, I mentioned earlier, we don't usually have a lot of room in our budget to bring in new grantees, but it's always helpful to learn about programs and organizations that are out there and keep them on our radar screen and have kind of a prospect list ready to go if there is an opening. But it's a lot of individual outreach.
You know, what I would say that I do more of right now at Rogers is have people call me, not seeking so much what support I can provide them, but who I can connect them to that I might know. And I am shocked how many people I actually know, because I'm not a really good networker.
I'm not.
I'm really not. It's not something I do, but I feel like that there's an element that we talked about, what you do beyond the grant, beyond the check and the relationship. And the biggest that we can provide is creating linkages to others who we might know that are more deeply aligned with yours. So you probably know more people, and I might think about accessing that, or it might have second level relationships with somebody who you can connect with. But I think using your network around that, so that sometimes it's direct, sometimes it's through an endorsement, sometimes it's the ability to just do something and reach out on your behalf. So I'd suggest you think about who you have in your network and who they might know, and that's actually a pretty good point of entry. I've found that it's been really successful for some of my former grantees.
yeah, and I would just, I want to just echo Christina, though, and say you are at the right place. The Foundation Center is the place that can really help you to think through how to do this work. This is what we're in business to do, is to help make those help develop the understanding so you can make those kinds of connections. Good.
Hi, yes, my name is Robin Fry. I'm director of Dance Kaiso, and I wonder if you could speak about how your foundations are thinking about arts in education, and specifically multicultural arts from the perspective of both the equity idea and also as You mentioned about making secondary connections with.
Could you just, I was just asking Lisa, I couldn't tell whether you're talking about arts education in the schools or arts education maybe in after-school time? Or as an independent outside?
Either and both, whichever you feel.
Again, I'll go back, again, arts education, from a parent of 2 kids at Oakland School for the Arts, a public charter school in Oakland, I just think it's an amazing strand of work. From a funder standpoint, I'm again going to go back to what does arts education represent in terms of the quality of the education of a young person to their entire academic career. One of the best schools in California right now focuses on dance as a strategy called the Gabriela Charter School in Los Angeles. I think that they were just awarded New School Ventures Fund's best and most outstanding charter, I can't remember. But they have amazing results academically and from a youth development standpoint. When you engage in the kids, and they have, I think, 85, 90% English language learner population, and their kids just knock it out. They're almost at 900 for their API, dead smack in the middle of hardcore Los Angeles and Echo Park. So it can be pretty transformative as a way of how young people learn, and I've seen it both personally as well as professionally in certain environments.
We believe that arts education is an essential component of education, and I personally believe, and I would actually say that I know, that when we started taking arts and music and recreation out of the traditional curriculum, that we lost an awful lot, because kids from elite areas could put it back in with after-school programs and paid lessons and club sports and things like that, and kids from the deep urban environments couldn't. Because of that, our Arts and Culture Program Officer, Tere Romo, and I have created a special stream of funding for arts in education, and we're focusing on our full-service community schools across the Bay Area in our first very, very small round of funding. And this is an unpublished area. You won't see it on our website yet, but this is the kind of commitment that we're trying to make, and we're trying to get some donors to sign on and be some champions of this so that we can really put more resources toward it.
All right, our last 2 questions. I think we're going to make it. Get everyone in.
Talk fast.
My name is Anon, and I just had a quick question about your foundation's viewpoints for increasing the pool of quality teachers. You guys, in the same scope of aligning the strategy with your own foundational strategy, how do you guys envision increasing the quality of teachers that we need to have? So, thanks.
Before I came to the San Francisco Foundation, I ran the CRESS Center at UC Davis, and we had the subject matter projects, teacher research, lesson study, as well as the California Healthy Start Initiative and the California After School Partnership. So that was like the whole continuum. I share that because in addressing teacher quality, we're sort of in a bind in terms of having to go with the regulations for the Commission on Teacher Credentialing. And those regulations are what is embraced first by the teacher training schools, mostly the CSUs in California, but also other teacher training schools. And so inserting conversations about race and equity, inserting conversations about developing a sense of mutual respect and that all means all, inserting conversations around urban, around poverty, around all the things that we think are really impacting quality of learning in the classroom are very difficult to do unless the Commission on Teacher Credentialing requires that classwork in order to get your teaching credentials. So it's sort of a chicken and an egg thing. Having said that, I think that organizations, for example, like the National Commission on Teacher Quality, that are spotlighting where the good teaching is going on and publishing some excoriating reports on teacher schools and I don't like everything that they've done, but I think that they've done some amazing things, are beginning to crack this hard nut of what goes into quality teaching. So I think that we're on to something. We look for the quality teaching applications that really speak to this sense of equity as we have sort of this emergent definition of what equity in the classroom means. But it's a tough one. If we can crack this one, we're going to have a fabulous teaching all across the United States.
And one model that I haven't mentioned yet that we support a lot of programs to do is teacher residencies. So at the onset of their careers, we essentially have teachers in the schools for a year or two working side by side with a mentor teacher. And in some cases, doctors have residency programs.
Yes.
Why don't we have this for teachers working with our children every day? So, looking at a teaching hospital model as well. So I can say more about that offline later, but I wanted to give that a shout out.
We'll squeeze in one quick last question.
Great, thank you so much. And thank you all, to the panel and to the Foundation Center for taking advantage of being the last questioner, expressing our gratitude for the opportunity to be here this morning. My name is Karen Bolke, and I'm actually with two organizations, West Coast-based, the Institute for Community Leaderships out of the state of Washington and the Martin Luther King Jr. Freedom Center in Oakland. And our work over the last 15 years has been sort of in the out-of-school model, but getting into the questions surrounding equity. And you just touched a little bit in the last question on what I'd really like to ponder together for a moment. In so many fields across our country right now, there's a lot of work going on around collective impact and collaboration. And yet in the field of education, where teaching and learning is at the essence of what we do, and we have these wonderful opportunities for students to be changing themselves and engaging in, kind of collaboration and, value-based learning that looks at interdependence and sort of sharing. The teacher and the learner have these great opportunities to sort of experiment together in, the pursuit of equity, but also in the pursuit of academic excellence and rigor and engagement and many of the sort of blended themes that we've been talking about this morning. And I'm curious if any of you happen to know of, either research or direct programming that's really ostensibly looking to link the role of education in promoting collaboration, sort of the we need to be better about building this big, big raft. I loved that statement. But, what's the role of education in helping us move in that direction? So I'm curious if you happen to have any insights. Thank you.
I'll jump in very quickly. I'm a very strong believer in the collective impact approach that's been thrown out and about. And there's lots of movements around the country that are doing it. I think you're seeing some of the first results around that, around Strive. So the pieces around that, I think, particularly for this room, is the range of partners in collaboration who have to move the systems that might be in transit right now about doing anything. And eventually the coming around and the linking up of the partnerships around that is, I think, what's critical around a collective impact approach. I think our team, Cassie Parham and Sanam Georgiani, working on our literacy work, is really trying to think about what collective impact and the approaches there of a backbone organization, really good data, strong communications, keeping everyone in the loop is key and critical, and making sure that there are tendrils back out to the system that they seek to influence. So for me, I think that there's some movement around that. So I've mentioned Strive and the Roadmap Project in Washington, which won one of the Race to the Top district projects, a 7-district collaboration led by a very lean, tremendous nonprofit organization called the Community Center for Education Results, is in the middle of that process, and they're taking a lot of those pieces together in collaboration, signed in blood with superintendents, board, and union. So I think you're seeing some of those things kind of happen out there right now, and it has to involve the communities that are involved around a cradle-to-career approach.
Our sense is that the full-service community schools model, done right, ideally, with mentorships, apprenticeships, project-based learning, and other kinds of community partnerships, is the education collective impact model.
Well, this has been really fascinating discussion. I want to thank our panelists, who I think just brought a tremendous breadth of insight. I think all of you have just raised some very interesting questions. It's great to have you here. And I'll tell you what I'm taking away from this, what I heard. There's real optimism about what can happen in this space, but it's got to be built on demonstrable results and taking a pragmatic perspective. It can't just be a great idea. You have to be able to show that it works. And I think that makes a lot of sense. And something I'll just note from my observations working across research on issue areas within philanthropy is that while data is playing an ever greater role in informing decision-making, education funders are way ahead of the curve. So they're the real leaders in this area, so it's something to keep in mind as you're thinking about your work and how you're approaching Grantmakers. So I just want to thank all of you for being here today. This was great.